Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here at the ADSD. It's a very unusual and interesting conference, and a lot of people have remarked that we're in the widest hotel in the world. It's been remarked by many. We're also about to, I think, tackle the widest topic in the world, which is the restructuring and rebalancing of the global economy. I should warn my panelists that we're at ADSD, and as a journalist, I'm congenitally suffering from ADHD. I'm hyperactive, I have a short attention span, and I tend to interrupt, but please don't take it personally. Let me just give a few, before I introduce this very distinguished and very diverse panel, let me just give a few framing remarks about this big topic of global economic restructuring. And I think one statistic captures it better than any other. In the year 2000, the United States accounted for 31% of the global economy, according to the IMF. And China accounted for about 5%. That's just 15 years ago. Fast forward to 2015, and the United States accounts for 23% of the global economy. So from just under a third to just under a quarter, and China accounts for 15% of the global economy, more than triple its share just 15 years ago. And indeed, in the next 3 or 4 years, we're going to see China overtake the United States in absolute terms as the largest economy in the world. And that, I don't think, has any parallel in human history, the speed of that kind of shift of economic gravity from one economy to another, from the West to the East. And not only that, but since 2008, since the global financial crisis, China has consistently, every year, been the largest engine of global growth. We haven't seen any other economy except the United States being the principal engine of global growth since for many, many, many decades. And consistently since 2008, China has been the principal engine of global growth. And of course, we have all sorts of impacts that we're going to get into in terms of Africa's growth rate. That's really been driven, and the Caribbean, that's really been driven by China's export demand for their commodities. And of course, here in United Arab Emirates, in the year 2000, Dubai, I believe, was the 9th or 10th largest international airport. It's now the largest international airport in the world, just 15 years later, overtaking Heathrow last year. There are all kinds of implications of the shift of economic gravity from west to east. But it isn't quite as simple and as linear as I've just made it sound. The US Federal Reserve is still by far the most important central bank in the world. The dollar is still the sole undisputed global reserve currency. And if we had a 25 basis point interest rate rise by the US Fed in December, it would have the kind of impact no other central bank could have. There are a lot of jitters in emerging markets about the impact of the turn in the interest rate cycle, and not least, in the commodity exporters, which have borrowed heavily in dollars, and any rise in US interest rates will lead to an appreciation of the dollar against their currency, and therefore a commensurate rise in the cost of their ability to pay off their dollar-denominated debts. So it's by no means a linear story. Now, with me here today, we have, in all respects but one, a very diverse panel. The one respect in which it isn't diverse is that there is no woman on this panel, which is unfortunate, but the plus side is that I can be rude and interrupt without feeling impolite. So to my immediate left, we have Chen Yiyi, who is the professor of Hebrew and Jewish studies at Peking University. To his left, we have Joel Netshitenzhe. I'm sorry, I've mispronounced Joel's name. Joel Netshitenzhe, I apologize, who is executive director at the Mapungubwe Institute, MISTRA, in South Africa. To his left, we have Leonel Fernández, the former president of the Dominican Republic and a distinguished lawyer and academic. To his left, we have Prasanta Kumar Pradhan, who is an associate fellow at IDSA, which is India's largest defense think tank based in New Delhi. And last but not least, on the end, we have a temporary, forgetting, Rexon Ryu. Sorry, Rexon, I didn't ask whether Ryu is the correct pronunciation of your last name.
It's actually Yu.
Okay, Yu. Okay, but from now on it's Rexon. So, who was the former chief of staff to Chuck Hagel, the Secretary of Defense, President Obama's Secretary of Defense, and is now at the Carnegie Institute as a senior advisor. So let me start by focusing on this all-important issue, China as the engine of global growth. Chen, in the last year or two, China has begun the long-awaited and much recommended internal rebalancing from an investment-led model to a consumption services-led model. A shift that's really epochal in terms of China's changing growth model. And your growth has slowed down quite considerably. You were growing at 9–10%. You're now officially at about 6.97%. Unofficially, most economists think it's more like 4%. And there have been some bumps along the road in this transition. Last summer, the stock market intervention in Shanghai caused a lot of people to lose their confidence in China's regulation of the markets. My question to you is, can China make this transition whilst remaining the principal engine of global growth? Is it capable of remaining the engine of global growth?
Thank you, Ed, for the question. I was pre-warned I'm going to put at the first to be on the grill. But I have, as customary, want to thank Dr. Abtasim for inviting me the second time, actually, to this debate. I was here last year, and I was told that because I was speaking very frankly, that's the reason I'm being invited back again. So I try my best. This morning on the internet news, I just saw a very popular social media YouTube song directed by the daughter of President Xi Jinping. He's the producer, 3 minutes, using English, singing about the 13th five-year plan of the Chinese government. It's a very funny song, and it's already had over 10 million hits on YouTube, which is a website that Professor Liu Kang already mentioned is not accessible within China. It's mainly as probably a propaganda, but telling that the structure of the current Chinese economy is a centralized planned economy, even though it's trying to release a lot of the force, the freedom to the market force, but it's still a centralized guided economy. As of the number you just mentioned, dropping from 9–10% all the way to 4%, I would say the way of measuring the growth is by itself is a Eurocentric or US-centric way of measuring. It's very hard to measure the size, economy of the size of China in such a relatively simple equation. So China is going through a very transition. The transition is very tough. The centralized leadership realized that the used to be infrastructure building, house building, real estate-driven economy, heavily relying on natural resources, including carbon energy from this part of the world, the GCC region, another part of the world, is no longer sustainable in the long run. And to handle that challenge, China is admitting already very widely within the Chinese elite circle since about 5 to 10 years ago that China needs to migrate to a more knowledge-based, innovation-driven, education-driven, and service-oriented economy. So that's not something new that just happened in a snap right after China found out that our growth rate is below 7%. It's actually happened over a decade ago. A big group of economists already worked on that proposal that lead eventually to this 13th five-year plan announced, I think, last week. So it's a transition that has been considered for a decade, and it's a transition happening right now. I think I always joke with some of the venture capital friends in the Silicon Valley. I always tell them, and they always tell me, for China, it's the economy, #1 world economy for the last 20th century, 18th century. China is #1, and then Britain and U.S. caught up. Now it's just continuing with the trend, as you just said. Probably China will become the #1 in the next century. So it's a blips in the 20th century. For 2 centuries, China left behind, and this is the whole meaning of this Chinese dream, trying to revive its own international status as a #1, as a centralized empire. This is not my own opinion, by the way. But I personally think, you asked me whether China will be succeeding in achieve this goal. I wish I could answer that. It's a multi-million-dollar question. I cannot answer it. But I think my personal view is, as a think tank scholar, for China to really achieve this goal. Right now, I think the most important thing is no longer economic reform or trying to change the status, the orientation, the main focus of the economic development from natural resource-related, infrastructure-related to knowledge base. Not even only the One Belt, One Road system trying to explore the surplus of the infrastructure building expertise and momentum to surrounding countries and building a new belt. I think the main focus probably would be on the political reform, which really release the innovation, creativity of the people.
I want to get into One Road, One Belt a little bit later, particularly in regards to where we are, the Middle East. But let me just pick you up on one point. You say it's a fairly subjective Western thing to measure growth rates. I think that the impact of China's slowing growth rates is very apparent in Africa, and in the Caribbean for that matter. These countries that have been exporting commodities to China at a rate of knots with your growth rate are now seeing recession. Or very, very drastic slowdowns. And we're seeing that across Africa. We're seeing that in Latin America, Brazil, countries like that. So let me now ask both Joel and Leonel, A, what the impact is on your economies of the China slowdown, and B, whether this is causing a rethinking about what your growth model should be in the future. Joel.
Thank you for the question. I think one of the major issues that we need to look at as we deal with this matter is whether someone else will take the baton of China. And there is the possibility that India might in fact extricate itself from the Hindi rate of growth. And already we have seen trends where it is climbing up with the rate of growth approaching that of China, and with projections that it might overtake China insofar as the rate of growth is concerned. So that's one element that we need to keep in mind. The second element that we keep in mind, in my view, are the other growth anchors across the world, which are emergent in the manner of popular acronyms. You have references to MINS, that is Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey, as focal points of growth. In Africa itself, there's reference to what is called KINGS, Kenya, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and Ghana. So even if China might be reconfiguring its economy, there might as well be other regions and other countries of the world that might take up that baton.
As an importer of your commodity, of your mining
sector. As importers of commodities, because they will be industrialized.
But my question is whether you're too dependent on those exports wherever they're going.
To the extent that industrialization in various parts of the world will continue, we still need to produce the commodities for such industrialization. But let me further indicate that the reconfiguration in China does not altogether subtract the need for some of these primary commodities. As far as I know, urbanization in China is going to grow for many decades to come. That will require high rates of investments in both commercial and residential properties, all of which will require some primary commodities. But maybe let's also look at the question. If the reconfiguration entails greater consumption demand on the part of the emergent middle class in China, what will that consumption be about? And can some of the countries in Africa take advantage of those opportunities? One can give some examples in this regard. Fruit would be the easiest example to give. So there would be commodities of that kind that the emergent middle class in China will need, and we need to reconfigure our trade relations, taking into account those changes that are happening in China and in other parts of the world.
And of course, both your economies, Leonel, do depend on growing Chinese tourism, middle class, so that's an export too in terms of your dollar earnings. Leonel, one of the interesting things about Latin America as a whole, South Central, is that although it's slowing down, and in fact by some measures this year it's going to shrink, principally because of Brazil, the one Latin American economy that's growing is Mexico. Mexico doesn't depend on China. It depends on the United States. Now, do you feel you've got too many eggs in one basket in terms of the China growth machine? What's the Dominican Republic and the Caribbean perspective on this?
Well, first of all, let me thank Dr. Ebtasami Al-Ketbi and my good friend Saeed Al-Khayed for having invited me to participate in this event. And I also indicate that I'm very pleased and honored to share this panel with such distinguished colleagues here today. Now, referring on the impact of China in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have to begin by understanding that Latin America and the Caribbean are 33 countries, and that we subdivide in regions. So you have Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean that are more direct connected with the US economy. And then you have South America, which in the last few years have been more integrated with the Chinese economy. And the South American countries have increased their commodities exports to China. In the period that China was growing at 10, 12%, there was a great demand for commodities coming from South America, specifically from Venezuela, for example, in terms of oil and gas. From Brazil, iron ore. From Chile, you have copper. Argentina, foodstuff. So there was a diverse commodities that were exported to China. Now, since there has been a slowdown in the Chinese economy in the last few years, especially this year, as you indicated, that most likely will grow less than 7%, it's been having a heavy impact in the South American countries. This year, ECLAC, which is the UN Agency for Economic and Social Development in the region, has projected that Latin America will grow only 0.5%. If you consider that for a whole decade, we're growing at nearly 5%, 4.5 and 5% as a region, now dropping to 0.5%, this has had a tremendous social and political impact in South America.
So when China sneezes, we're all catching colds.
Yes, well, that's correct. Now, you talked about Mexico. Mexico is growing nearly 3%. Dominican Republic is growing over 5%. And the Central American countries are doing relatively well, especially Panama, due to the huge investments in the expansion of the Panama Canal, is growing around 6%. Now, what is the difference? Why is Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean having greater economic growth rate than South America? Because they're integrated with the US economy. They're more integrated to the US economy. And because the US has adopted a stimulus growing economy, especially through quantitative easing monetary policies, The US is growing 2.8, 2.9%, and is somehow contributing to sustained economic growth in the sub-regions of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean.
So, in terms of are we putting too many eggs in one basket, your caveat just noted. Of course, I'm from Britain, and a couple of weeks ago, the Queen was toasting Xi Jinping because Britain is very clearly putting its eggs in the China growth model basket. But a lot of people are talking about a switch of global engines, Prasanta, from China to India. As Joel mentioned, 2015 is the first year in recent memory where India's growth rates are going to be higher than that of China. And indeed, not just your GDP growth, but your foreign direct investment numbers have overtaken China for the first time. And that might reflect more the shift of China from investment-led to consumption. But India is outperforming. Let me ask you a question by way of an anecdote. Narendra Modi got elected last year on the promise to create jobs, and he said he would stand or fall by his job creation record. Now, last month, the government of Uttar Pradesh, India's largest state, more than 200 million people, advertised 300 jobs, very low-level government jobs, T-boys, essentially. And the criteria for applying for these jobs was that you needed 4 years of high school experience and a bicycle so that you could deliver stuff. The number of applications the government of Uttar Pradesh received was 250,000 applications, of whom something like a third had undergraduate degrees, and of whom something like 400 had PhDs. So we talk about India, the growth shifting to India, but can India actually create growth for its own people, let alone demand for the rest of the world?
Thank you.
And sorry to kick it off with a tough question.
Doesn't matter. So
and move the mic
at the outset,
a bit
I must thank EPC and Dr. Tisham for inviting me. And to your question, it's quite interesting question, and you are right about that advertisement for the post and government lower levels. And the people, basically the young men who are applying were highly qualified for that post. That shows that we have so much of human resources, but the economy is not being able to absorb all of them. So this is one point. And so far as India as an engine of growth in the region or in the world, I would say that since 1991, India has been making good strides after its initiation of the policy of liberalization and globalization. By that policy of liberalization and globalization, India intended to integrate more and more deeply with the international economic system. And since that time, I think India has done quite well. And at one point of time, you would know that India grew at a rate of 8% per annum. And that growth, the pace of that growth was hit during recession. That is affecting the whole world, and that is India. It was only obvious that it was affecting India. So that pace of that growth was affected and stopped. Now since last a few years, that growth has been picked up. And now the growth rate would be around 7%. And at one point of time, India desired to grow at a rate of 10%. But unfortunately, that happened.
It ought to be mentioned in the context of the global commodities super cycle, which tends to last 15 years historically, of reductions in commodity prices for large chunks of time, followed by market corrections and then a rise in prices, that India is a beneficiary along with China. You are not a commodities exporter, you are a commodities importer. The collapse in the oil price, the collapse in the copper price, the collapse in all these prices is good for the net terms of trade for India. I guess I'm trying to challenge you on whether India shouldn't be doing a lot better. Growth rates of 7% sound good, but when you've got per capita income of $1,500, it's pretty easy. You should be getting higher.
I completely agree with you. The potential India has is huge, but that has not been able to realize that because of several internal challenges. The challenges being so much of demographic pressure that you understand. That 1.2 billion Indian population, that's only second largest world population. And there is too much of poverty, there's too much of unequal distribution of wealth that has been established in the society. And there is so much of unemployment. So there is so much of underdevelopment around. If you go to rural areas, I'm sure you must have been there. So these are a few reasons which actually pull back India. But I would say on a positive note that since 1991, India has done a very good work and a lot made strides.
We'll get in a little bit later into where the jobs are going to come from, not just in India, but everywhere.
Yeah.
Because we might be on the wrong topic here. It might be that economic gravity is shifting to robots, not to China. Rexon, from the position, from the vantage point of having been in the heart of the Pentagon, which isn't America's wealth creator, but it's certainly its wealth spender, the Pentagon, has, like everybody else in the United States government, had to make do with much constrained budgets in recent years. And it looks like if the long-term projections for US growth are correct, which is 2% a year, as opposed to the 3% that we've been used to in the last few decades, it looks like you're going to have to get used to this permanently, much, much more constrained military budgets. My question to you is, what does that do to the American strategic mindset? This era of relative and enduring austerity, what does that do to the planning psyche of the spenders of American wealth at the Pentagon and elsewhere?
So thanks, Ed. And first, just let me add my thanks to the organizers, Dr. Etissam and the Emirates Policy Center. A pleasure to be here. So to your question, let me start broad, and then I'll move towards the specific question. I think, Ed, you're right that there are certainly challenges for the United States, like I think most other major economies around the world, in terms of the outlook, projections, and the trajectory. And from the U.S. perspective, I think there have been several actions taken, both from a public policy and government perspective, but also driven by the private sector to try to get at some of these underlying sources of economic power for our country. Will they affect the projection you mentioned? We don't know, we'll have to see. But the question of healthcare reform, the question of our energy outlook, and the issue of innovation and technology, I think all go to the point that I'm not prepared to buy into the projection that it's 2% vice 3% in terms of the outlook. But if you were to assume...
Okay, let me rephrase the question in that case. Forget what's being projected. Let's look at what's happened. And I started this off by saying in the year 2000, the United States had 31% of the global economy and China had 5%. Mm-hmm. In the year 2015, the United States has 23% of the global economy and China has 15%. What has that massive shift in economic gravity done to the horizons of American policymakers, and particularly national security policymakers?
So I think there's no question that as you look at the global economy, that there's clearly growth and diversification outside of the United States. No question about that. As you relate that to national security, in terms of an ability for the United States to project power, for the military to plan and make assumptions about our ability to have a presence and to address issues from around the world, it does go down, comes back to some of these fundamentals of economic power. So our ability to grow, to the heart of your question. So in an environment of constrained budgets, whether it's from our growth rate or from the amount of our budget that's consumed by fixed costs that we have, there's no question that this is a more challenging environment for the Department of Defense, for the Pentagon, in terms of how they think about forces. I think the issue of technology and innovation is very relevant to the question of our military power here. And just in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a new premium placed within our national security environment over the next revolution in military innovation, in defense innovation. And I think that's going to be central here. But it does, there's, you can't get around the fact that if it's either from growth rates or from political deadlock in Washington and the reality of a sequestration level budget, it makes it far more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, we'd probably be straying too far from our topic, but at sort of 0% real growth in your budget, defense budget, compared to double-digit annual growth rates, that's quite a big shift year after year. But let's not wander off topic. No, we're talking about rebalancing of global growth, and that's well understood. There has been and is an ongoing shift from west to east, but we're assuming that it's just a reweighting within the existing economic structure. And the title of this panel, after all, is about economic restructuring. So what I'd like to focus on next is the degree to which the structure, and not just the weighting of the global economy, is changing. And all of you feel free to chip in, but I am again going to pick on Chen Yiyi first, since China is in the hot seat. We've had 2 or 3 developments recently that have a bearing on this all-important future structure of the global economy. The first is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the largest trade deal since the Uruguay round has been concluded. It excludes China very pointedly, and the rhetoric from the United States has been that it will box China in to a system of rules devised by others. That's one development. Another is the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as an alternative, as a rival or a complement, depending on which way you look at it, to the World Bank, to the existing Bretton Woods, US-led Bretton Woods institutions. So my question to you, and I want people to chip in, or I'll bring you in. My question to you is China reacting to American attempts to constrain you, or are you proactively trying to change the world economic order?
Thank you, Ed. That's a tough question, but it's a good one. TPP. TPP and AIIB, that's the 2 key terms. TPP, as you said, is to box in China, box out China. China has been, I would say, partially because of cultural reasons. The Chinese thousands of years of understanding, different understanding of the commercial trades, agreements, legal system, jurisdiction, all these. Since joining the WTO, China's, I would add my personal observation is because of the political system, the one-party rule, all kind of slowed down China's own integration and realizing its own promise when China joined the WTO. So I would not say violating, by not meeting all those progress, there are frustration among partners that right now are members of the TPP. So that's one of the way of seeing China being boxed out. The AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is an effort actually happened right before the collapse of the Chinese stock market. Mm-hmm. Back then, China committed over, I think, 30 billions of seeding money. Don't quote me on the number, but it's something like that. And looking for other countries and private money to jump in.
50 members, $100 billion of capital.
100 billion.
50 members, including all of Europe, essentially. The only 2 countries that have stayed out are Japan and the United States.
Thank you, Ed, for that number. You're the expert. But right now, China, I think, I would not say waste, but used a large chunk of that probably planned or promised seeding money in the salvation of the stock market. That's by my own observation from reading the public sources. So even though the effort by the central government is still pushing this AIIB, you don't hear a lot about it in the media right now.
Okay, so that's a short-term thing to do with the politics of managing your stock market crisis. My question is the longer term. Does China aspire to change the structure of the global economic order?
Okay. My personal view is China is trying to do that. At least the top leadership today, led by the President Xi Jinping himself, have the ambition. By observation, he has ambition, but the large, higher layer of elites that actually implement and execute the vision of the economic part of the Chinese dream are more sober and realistic in terms of the lack of experience in finance, in management, in logistics, in terms of challenging the status quo of the US, leading the global economic order. But efforts on the...
So there's a debate.
It's a debate internally, I think, and it's a debate, it's an effort of test and trial to see whether we can do something. The AIIB is one effort. The internationalization of the RMB is another effort. Trying to build one road, one belt, trying to have a different partnership with other neighbors is another effort, including challenging situations right now in South China Sea. It's a way of the Deng Xiaoping's internal reform, economic reform is touching the stone and crossing the river. Right now is the touching the stone, crossing the river in the more international sphere.
So you're feeling your way as you cross these torrents of international challenges. Rexon, do you agree with that? Do you think that China is unsure, it's ambivalent about whether it's challenging the economic order or responding to your country's exclusion of it from certain key pieces of the economic order, such as TPP?
Well, okay, so I would say a couple things. First, I would say that my observation of the approach by the Chinese to some of the structures has been to evaluate them realistically to see what's in their interest. And occasionally they choose to join, occasionally they choose other means, but that the reality, again, to what I said earlier, the diversification of the global economy, I think, has brought new realities to a structure that dates back to the beginning, to the end of World War II. And that there are, to a degree, it's almost been inevitable that there will be a process of evolution of the institutions that frame the global economy. To the point on the TPP, I would take issue, I guess, with the phrasing you started with. That,
I'm a journalist. I'm allowed to talk loosely.
To say that this was deliberately and pointedly intended to exclude China. There have certainly been stories written to that effect, but that's not how it's been framed by the senior leaders of the Obama administration.
I wouldn't agree with you on that, actually. I mean, if the idea is that China isn't developed enough, why is Vietnam part of TPP?
Well, we can get into a back and forth. I mean, but
right.
The South Korean government, South Korea wasn't part of the negotiations either.
Prasanta, you were going to chip in.
Yeah, I mean, we are talking about the U.S. losing global economic hegemony. We're talking about a shift.
Speak up a little bit, or bring the mic closer.
We are talking about U.S. losing global economic hegemony. We are talking about shift of economic power from west to east. I think this is a process which would take a longer time, and this is not going to happen. And more than U.S. losing, I would say that it is others who are gaining. And particular context, in this context, I would make particular mention of China, which has really been growing up fast.
So it's not a zero-sum game. Everybody can gain from the rise of... No, that's fair enough. I mean, I did want to pick up Rexon on one other point, which is that in terms of the shift of weight, of global economic weighting. I think China's weighting at the IMF is something like 3.6%. It's smaller than France. And you've got a deal negotiated successively by the Bush and Obama administrations to reweight the IMF to give China, India, South Africa, and others a much larger representation in line with where their economies have grown. But Congress is blocking it. So there is clearly a sort of self-inflicted damage here in terms of the story of the creation of the AIIB, of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, isn't there?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Very different perspective of what China represents in the developing economies. South Africa and many of your neighbors have been borrowing from China, have been getting loans without conditions, have been getting big investments in your commodities sector, and have been increasingly turning up your noses to the World Bank, which has all these conditionalities, which has all these rules and due processes that China doesn't have. Does that, from your point of view, mean a shifting of the global economic structure? And do you welcome a more formal manifestation of that in the creation of Chinese-led institutions, not just bilateral Chinese initiatives?
There should definitely be a formal repositioning of global financial institutions, the multilateral institutions, starting off with the Bretton Woods institutions themselves. As you are saying, the fight around this has been going on for a few years, for a few decades, but much more still needs to be done. And it is appreciable that a country as well endowed financially as China is taking the initiative to ensure that beyond the existing institutions, there are forums to which developing countries can go in order to speed up their programs of infrastructure development, of industrialization, and so on. But perhaps if you can allow me, I want to come back to the question that you had posed earlier to the other colleagues, that as we look at the trade agreements, whether it be TPP or the transatlantic one, we need to pose to ourselves the question whether these trade agreements will change the fundamental trend in production processes across the globe. The dispersal of the production processes, what Manuel Castells calls the production process where companies produce as a unit in time across the globe. And China would remain one of those production centers. That's the first issue. The second issue, the global companies are looking for large markets, and China will remain a large market for all kinds of products from the West, products that can be produced in China itself. And we also need to look, I think, at contradictory tendencies that are playing themselves out. You can talk about the TPP, but at the same time, there's the AIIB, the Infrastructure Investment Bank, and to the chagrin of the United States, most of the Western countries have joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And many of us, I think, were watching askance from abroad with regard to the visit of the Chinese president to the United Kingdom. So at the same time, as you might quote one instance that suggests the isolation of China, there are other trends that suggest otherwise. I think we need to keep in mind.
That's very well observed. No, that's a very good point. I mean, I suppose what's most interesting is whether China actually represents a model. So there's been a lot of talk about the passing of the Washington Consensus, but what exactly does China stand for? I mean, from the perspective of other emerging markets, what model are we talking about here? Leonel?
Well, Some would say it is state capitalism.
Again, closer.
Some would say it's state capitalism in the sense that China's economic model is based on state control. Now, but going back to one of your key questions, indicating that in 2000, the U.S. represented 30% of world output, and China just 5%, and in 15 years, there's been a major change, a drop to 23% from the U.S., an increase to 15% from China, which is a remarkable historical achievement. But this, if we go back to the end of World War II, 1945, U.S. represented around 70% of world economic output. So in half a century, there was a drop from 70% to 30%, and now to 23%. And the question is, which was, I think, brought up originally back in the 80s by a great British historian, Paul Kennedy, is the U.S. in decline? And I would say it is not exactly that the U.S. is in decline, which perhaps some indicators might show that, but it is the rise of the rest. I think there is a rebalancing in terms of world global positioning, that we have emerging markets now. And so it is a more pluralistic world that we are participating on this occasion.
And that rise of the rest has been underwritten by global rules enforced and upheld, and in many cases written by the United States, Pax Americana. It's within an American system.
Yes, it is, because we're still within the Bretton Woods system that was created after the World War II.
And this is why this question is so key.
Yeah.
Is that system under challenge?
And it needs to change. There needs to be a major overhaul, because exactly what we're living in this second decade of the 21st century has nothing to do with what took place at the end of World War II. It's a different world. For example, we from emerging economies in the Caribbean or South Africa, why is always a European that has to be the Director General of the IMF? Just a simple question.
No, you mean why is it somebody from France?
From France, well, more specifically, even more specifically. But why does it always have to be an American, the president of the World Bank? Why can it be from China, from South Africa, from Latin America, from whatever? But necessarily, why always an American is the president of the World Bank, and a French or European has to be the Director General of the IMF? Very two simple questions. Well, you also need a major overhaul within the UN system, beginning with the Security Council, which does not represent current power representation around the world. So there needs to be new rules for global governance in the economics and the political side in order to move forward.
So if you ask economists about an economy's competitiveness, what's the real secret source of what makes economies strong over time? They don't point to commodities, they don't point to labor, they don't even point to education directly. They point to the ability to innovate. Now, I think if you did a poll of economists around the world, including in China, nobody would dispute that the United States remains the most innovative economy in the world. I want Rexon and Chen, both of you, to look at what you see as China's prospects for becoming a rival innovator to the United States, whether that's realistic within the foreseeable future, or whether that sort of, I guess, golden goose of economic growth over the long term is something that is going to remain elusive. Rexon, what are your thoughts, and what are American strategic thinkers' thoughts about China's ability to innovate?
So I think the short answer to your question is that we've already seen substantial evidence of an ability to innovate, not just in the United States and not just in China, but in a range of places around the world. And I think that the potential for China is substantial. The premise of your comment, I think, is key to the question of how do we think about the future. Many panelists this morning have pointed to the cusp we appear to be on now in terms of the sweeping implications for technology and innovation to touch all aspects of life, of an individual's relationship with their government, of their prospects for well-being and prosperity. And I think that it is exceedingly relevant here to this discussion of how we think about the global economy in the future. And as I mentioned earlier, the strength of innovation is, from my view, one of the pillars of economic growth for the United States. Coming back to your point about the projections for the United States, but I think it is a topic for future EPC sessions to grapple with what does this really mean for countries around the world.
Chen?
I'll give an example of how the innovation spirit. I mean, if you compare China, you see China and the U.S. are two opposite enemies of in the innovation effort in technology, green technology, science. I would say that's a black and white picture, which is not the reality. The reality is, if you take a look at the most active funding sources of the innovation, the Silicon Valley venture capital community, the Wall Street, and also in some extent in some parts of Israel, the so-called startup nation, all the activities are intermingled together, including many of the sovereign funds from GCC. Their investment is going into, in different disguises, to many of the Israeli companies, many of the US companies or Chinese companies. If you take a look at the share structure of Alibaba that Professor Liu just mentioned this morning, you will see Chinese sovereign fund in it, Chinese prominent family members shares in it, and also GCC sovereign funds, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, all the VCs, and also Israeli funds. And Chinese funds are going into Israel to buy their #1 chemical company, to buy their #1 dairy company, and also going to the US trying to buy, but for national security reasons, some of the offers are rejected.
So there's no shortage of Chinese ambition, and there's no shortage of capital. I suppose the question is whether there is the requisite freedom for researchers to create the entrepreneurial, innovative serendipity that you associate with Silicon Valley.
Yeah, that's a very, very acute point. Actually, this is the thing that I debate with myself too, is whether China can give a fully free atmosphere for the science and technology innovators or scholars, scientists to work fully without a freer political system. I personally have doubts on that, but many of the government leaders and scholars and think tank scholars think that's possible. One example is Alibaba, which is closely tied with the central government, and also the WeChat, which is no longer a copycat of any WhatsApp or whatever other social media or Facebook. It's actually a superior to combine all these Western social media apps that is being copycatted by the US and the Israelis too.
Prashant, do you have thoughts on that? I mean, India's innovative capacity may be greater by the freedom measure.
Yeah, in the face of, one more point I would like to make is, in the face of talking about restructuring the world order, economic order, if China is trying to catch up with US, and there are also many other powers like Japan, there is India, there is Brazil. So in the future, we might see the multiple economic powers rising in the world. And one more important point I would like to highlight is the rise of Asia in particular. You talk about China, talk about Japan, Korea, India. Those powers were growing really rapidly. And one interesting feature in the rise of China is the fact that among these Asian powers, there is too much of misunderstanding in terms of politically, geographically, boundary-wise, etc. But when it comes to economy, they seem to be united. Only yesterday, there were leaders of China, Japan, and Korea meeting and talking about trade and economic development. But politically, there is so much of misunderstanding. There is some issues between China and India. There are also political issues between China and Japan, China and South Korea. But when it comes to economics, it seems that Asia is united. So the growth and development of Asia and role of Asia in the future world order is going to be prominent. And lastly, in the future world order, I see there is a rise and strengthening of regional economic organizations. Like we have GCC in the Gulf, we have ASEAN, we have EU, and we have TPP coming, we have TTIP. So there's so much of there is so much of focus on regional economic groupings. I think this is going to be the order of the day.
We're going to go to questions in a minute, but let me just introduce a couple of other really important themes when we think of this big subject of global economic restructuring. And this is a particularly important theme in the context of where we are. You mentioned the GCC in the Middle East, in the Gulf. Namely that it's quite clear, it's pretty much economic consensus, that those economies that get higher female labor force participation rates, that get more women educated and into the workforce, are going to have greater capacity and greater growth potential as time goes on. Now, I don't know whether China's abandonment of the one-child policy last week is related to that, whether that was an economically as well as a politically, it was clearly a demographic decision, but whether there was a sort of key females in the labor force component to that decision. But it's clear in general that the more women you have in the labor force, the more competitive you're going to be. Now, would you like to just briefly comment on your own countries and their efforts? I mean, America is an exception to some degree, but not to a whole degree. Would you like to comment on your own countries about the prospects for women's future in the labor force? And would you also, unfortunately, we don't have somebody from the Middle East on this panel. We were going to get Basim Awadallah, but unfortunately he had to pull out. But we don't have either a woman or somebody from the Middle East, so I'm conscious that you're not any more qualified to talk about Middle Eastern female labor force participation rates than I am. But if you'd like to give your comments about the role of women in your respective economies and efforts to increase, starting with Chen because of the one-child announcement, then that would be a good moment to then move to questions.
Okay, for China, women as a part of the workforce has not been an issue since the new communist era. I think China probably had the largest percentage of female workforce in China, in the world, among the top leaders. So the one-child policy, it's been debated for the last decade, and the initial starting of the policy is only arranged for 30 years, and now it's the 4th decade. So it's time to end it, and it has obviously economic implication, consumption patterns, and all the economic development implications to be studied. That's my comment.
Okay, I think briefly to respond in relation to South Africa, one can say that equality and gender equity in society is a matter of constitutional imperative. The Constitution decrees that there should be equal treatment of men and women. There are various sectors of society where this is starting to manifest, given our history. If you look at representation in Parliament, we're approaching 50-50 now. If you look at both general employment and management in the public sector, we're approaching the 40s in terms of percentage. But the private sector is lagging behind, and much more need to be done in that regard. If there is a fundamental lesson that we have learned from trying to implement this policy, it is that the ideal and the objective should be combined with the creation of conditions that are conducive for women to be able to participate at various levels.
And what are the big inhibitors?
Some of the big inhibitors would be simply, do you have crashes at workplaces? Do you give men and husbands paternity leave? Do you ensure that you guarantee women's employment once they come back from maternity? It's the combination of those kinds of objective things that would help.
President, you'll forgive me, but you're from a pretty macho culture, the Dominican Republic. What are women's economic horizons there?
Well, in the Dominican Republic, there has been a growing consciousness over the years about the need to empower women, not only for the workforce, but for society in general. So in 2010, we made a constitutional amendment, broad constitutional amendment in the Dominican Republic, and we introduced a clause indicating that there is parity between, there's equality between men and women in all aspects of life. So that means that women empowered by our Constitution have the same rights as do men in terms of education, healthcare, social security, labor, etc. And this is something that is increasing in our country. For example, electoral participation. There is a law that at least 33% of all the candidates must be women. And that needs to have territorial representation, so that in every municipality, in every province, there needs to be at least 33% of women representation in terms of electoral choosing. Also, for the same labor realized, there must be equal wages between men and women. At this point, we see more women at the higher educational level than men. Women participating in the private sector, women holding public service offices. So there has been an extension of women empowerment in the Dominican Republic, and I think that makes a great contribution in terms of economic output, but at the same time, it has an impact for families, their well-being. It's better to have two salaries at home than just one. It alleviates family burdens, and so there is some sense of mutual respect among householders nowadays because of all this transformation, taken with the family way of participating in different walks of life in our country.
Prasanta, India doesn't have a one-child policy, but your gender ratio is just the same as China's. You've got a lot more boys than girls, particularly in the North Bing. Is that going to be changed? Is that going to be addressed head-on by this government?
See, women in workforce in India, the number has been always less, the participation of women. I don't have the exact data, but it's obviously less. And but I would say that in the last over 1 decade, there has been remarkable progress in this field, both by government sectors as well as in the private sector. In recent years, the private sector has been a major attraction for participation of women in the workforce, particularly in the IT industry. You'll find many IT engineers, IT professionals, managers, women are being encouraged, in fact, to join. So far as the government sector is concerned, government is also promoting. I would also say that the Constitution is not any way barring women to participate in any job. The Constitution is gender neutral that way. And you see there is, in many government jobs, you would find reservation for women as well. That is, in some places, that different from state to state. In some states, you would find the reservation is around 33%. And even in Indian Parliament, there is a debate going on nowadays since many years that there should be reservation for women of around 33%.
So I'm told we have to catch up with time, so we're not going to have, we were running quite a bit late, we're not actually going to have time for questions. Rexon, do you have any parting comments?
I'll yield my time.
So I'll probably better be popular with ADSD and actually close it here so that we're a little bit back onto the schedule. So please join me in thanking a wonderful panel for some very interesting and diverse thoughts. Thank you.